DB Cooper.
Okay.
You know? Like the name alone, pretty much, it just means unsolved mystery, right? I mean, it's a story that's just captivated everybody, like, for decades. And, well, today, we're going on a deep dive into the case. We've got these excerpts, right, from an encyclopedia
All
entry.
right.
We're going to try to separate fact from fiction. Who knows? Maybe we'll find something new, What do you think? Ready to take the plunge?
Absolutely. Let's dive right in. I mean, it's a case just riddled with questions, unanswered questions. Fascinating to see how even the tiniest little details, they can spark whole new theories.
Okay, so let's set the scene, all right? It's November 24th, 1971, so the day before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
A man looking totally average, like, mid-40s, maybe 6 feet tall, he buys a one-way ticket
Mm-hmm.
on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle, uses the name Dan Cooper,
Oh, okay.
which I'm sure ended up being an alias.
Well, it's interesting how that alias Dan Cooper kind of morphed into DB Cooper, like a reporter misheard it or something.
Right, right.
That little mistake,
Mhm.
it ended up just adding to the whole mystique, right, of the case. It's like almost as if it was meant to be like, shrouded in mystery from the very beginning.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah, exactly. It adds to the legend. But back to the hijacking. Shortly after takeoff, Dan Cooper, he slips a note to a flight attendant, right? It's a bomb threat.
Mhm.
And to make it even more convincing, he opens his briefcase, shows wires, red sticks, a battery.
Oh, wow.
What do you think about that?
That display,
Yeah.
the bomb components, it's fascinating. Like, it goes beyond just like a simple threat.
Oh,
He
yeah.
wanted to make like a real specific psychological impact, I think, on the flight attendant.
Yeah.
And then, by extension, the whole crew.
Mm-hmm.
It demonstrates, I think, a level of planning, of control that goes beyond just like your typical impulsive,
Yeah.
criminal act.
Yeah, he knew how to make an impact. And his demands. He wanted 4 parachutes.
Yeah.
And $200,000 in $20 bills,
Wow.
which would be over $1.2 million today.
Oh, wow.
I always think about that $20 bill detail. Why be so specific,
That's one of the most intriguing parts of the case, I think.
Yeah.
Was there like a practical reason for that, you think? Maybe $20 bills were like less likely to be flagged or traced? Or maybe it was just psychological,
Yeah.
Another way to be in control, to differentiate himself. Like, I don't know. What do you think?
I kind of think it's the psychological angle. I think that makes it more interesting, right?
Yes.
Adds another layer of intrigue to his persona. So the exchange happens at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. He releases the 36 passengers, right,
Sure.
in exchange for the money and the parachutes. He keeps the pilots, a flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant on board.
Mm-hmm.
They refuel, and then he tells them to fly towards Mexico City at an altitude below 10,000 feet and a speed slower than 200 knots. Why those specific instructions?
Those instructions, along with choosing the Boeing 727,
Yeah.
points to a really
Okay.
crucial detail. The rear air stairs.
Okay.
That was a feature like unique to certain airplanes back then.
Right.
By demanding like the low altitude and slow speed, it ensured that those stairs could be lowered during the flight.
Right.
Basically, creating his escape route.
Okay.
It's a technical thing that a lot of people miss, but it was super important to his whole plan.
And then around 8 p.m., somewhere between Seattle and Reno, most likely near Ariel, Washington, Cooper lowers the air stairs and jumps. Just vanishes. It's hard to believe, jumping from a plane in the dark, maybe not even that experienced at skydiving,
Right.
over unfamiliar terrain.
It gets crazy.
What do you think his chances were? Surviving?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, while his, airplane choice and all that, it suggests some planning, there's so many things against him.
Yeah.
High winds, the dark, the terrain,
Yeah.
the possibility he wasn't an experienced skydiver, and then the parachutes themselves.
Wait, what about the parachutes? Did something go wrong with them?
Well, one of the parachutes he got, it was a dummy chute, like sewn shut. It was for training.
Oh.
Now, a good skydiver would have, seen that right away.
Right.
But the fact that he seemingly didn't, it raises doubts about his, expertise.
Yeah.
This detail, it really adds like fuel to the theory that he might not have made it.
That's something I hadn't really thought about. It makes it even more complex. So we have this amazing escape, but then what? The The FBI, they started a huge investigation, right? Codename NORJAC,
Yeah.
short for Northwest Hijacking.
Right.
And it became one of their like longest, most intense cases.
Oh, absolutely. The FBI, they put so much into this case. At first, they thought Cooper must have some flight experience or military background or something. But as they investigated more, like we saw with the parachute, those ideas, they kind of fell apart. What's really cool about NORJAC is how it shows both like the progress and the limits
Yeah.
of like investigations back then.
So what were some of those advancements and limitations? Like what could they do back then?
Well, for instance, they were using, fairly new techniques like handwriting analysis
Okay.
and even early forms of like psychological profiling, right?
Right.
To try to narrow down the suspects.
Right.
But they were also limited by what technology they had.
Yeah.
DNA analysis, which later became like a super important tool. It was just starting out.
Yeah.
And remember, this was way before security cameras everywhere, so they really relied on people who saw it and like physical evidence.
So it sounds like they were putting together a puzzle with like tons of missing pieces.
Yeah.
And over 800 suspects were investigated in just the first 5 years. They followed so many leads, but couldn't say for sure it was anybody. It's wild how someone could just vanish.
It really shows how good Cooper was at hiding.
Hmm.
Like not having that definite proof and then time passing, it's kept the mystery going. And that's what keeps us interested, right?
Yeah.
The idea that maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
he got away with it.
It's a captivating thought, but before we imagine Cooper, living it up on a tropical island somewhere, let's talk about Richard McCoy. He did a similar hijacking just a few months later. He had to be a main suspect, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. McCoy's case is like a textbook example of the copycat effect. When a big crime happens, it makes other people want to try their luck. And the two hijackings were really similar.
Yeah.
But the descriptions people gave didn't quite match up. And McCoy was already in jail when they finally did DNA testing on Cooper's tie, so they ruled him out.
So back to the drawing board. And maybe the biggest question. Did D.B. Cooper actually survive that jump? High winds, rough terrain, a possibly bad parachute. It doesn't sound good. But there's always that like nagging feeling that maybe he made it.
It's that pull of the unknown, that what if. And it's a question that still divides people, even the pros,
Right.
But before we jump into all the theories about what happened to Cooper, let's look at something that brought the mystery back in 1980. A bunch of old $20 bills found by the Columbia River.
Right, the money. That always throws a wrench in things.
Yeah.
Like a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to the mystery. The serial numbers match the ransom, but no Cooper. What does that mean? Was it planted there? Did he stash it before he jumped? Did someone else get a hold of it?
It's a clue that makes you wonder, but it doesn't give you any answers. And that's what's so cool about this case, right? Even with solid evidence like the money, there's still so much room to think, to debate, to imagine different scenarios.
Yeah, it really is a story that just grabs you, isn't it? And it's even more fascinating because we're still arguing about how it ends. Right, like did he survive? Did he just disappear? Did he pull off the perfect crime? Those questions are why we keep coming back to it even after all these years. And as we've been talking about, there's evidence for both sides.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive so cool. We're not just repeating the same old story. We're looking at the evidence and thinking about the possibilities and trying to understand why D.B. Cooper still fascinates us so much.
So let's talk about those possibilities. You mentioned evidence for both sides of whether he lived or not. What are some of the things that make people think he might have actually survived?
Well, besides the fact that it's just a great story, there are a few things that support the survival theory. First, there's his choice of plane and those detailed instructions. Like we talked about demanding the Boeing 727 with the rear air steers flying low, requesting specific parachutes. All of that points to him thinking it out way ahead of time, more than just a spur-of-the-moment thing.
Yeah.
It makes it seem like he had a plan, a really detailed one.
That's true. It does seem like he put a lot of thought into getting away. But couldn't you also see that as someone trying to look like they knew what they were doing, even if they weren't a real skydiver?
That's a good point, and it's something people have argued about for years. Was he a pro who knew exactly what he was doing, or just a desperate guy who got lucky? The fact that he didn't notice the dummy parachute makes you think maybe he was the second one.
Speaking of that dummy parachute, it's weird how that one detail has become so important when people talk about his skills and if he could have lived. What do you think about how big of a deal that is? Does it really prove he wasn't a real skydiver?
It's definitely something to think about, and it's hard to imagine a real pro missing something that important.
Yeah.
But we have to remember, we only know so much. We don't know for sure which parachute he used or if he even had time to check them all out when things were happening so fast. It's possible he messed up even if he had jumped before.
That makes sense. There are always those things we don't know that could change how we see it. But even if we say, okay, maybe he did survive that jump, what happened after? He would have landed in the middle of nowhere in the dark, maybe with nothing. Could he really have stayed hidden all this time?
That's where the survival theory gets even harder to believe. Some people think he had people waiting for him, others think he stashed supplies ahead of time, and some think he was just super resourceful and got lucky. But let's be real, surviving the jump was just the first part. Staying hidden for decades without a trace that would have been way harder.
It seems impossible, but then again, we are talking about D.B. Cooper, the guy who seemed to break all the rules. And then there's the money that clue that keeps showing up. Finding those old $20 bills by the Columbia River in 1980 really messed things up. What are the main theories about that?
That's a great question, and there are a few different ideas trying to explain the money. One theory is that Cooper, knowing he might not make it, stashed some of the money before as a backup plan. Like if he died, at least some of the loot would be found, maybe leading investigators away from who he was or where he was.
That's an interesting theory. It makes him seem even more clever, like he was thinking way ahead, even past the hijacking itself.
Exactly, and it goes back to how much he seemed to plan and think ahead. Another theory is that the money was washed downstream from where he jumped, maybe carried by floods or erosion over time. This fits with what we know about how the river has changed since 1971.
So nature could have moved the money, making it look like someone put it there on purpose. It's a pretty convincing explanation. But I bet some people think it was planted maybe by someone trying to trick investigators or even to cash in on the D.B. Cooper story.
You're right. The planted money theory is popular, and it often gets mixed up with bigger conspiracy theories about the case. Some people believe Cooper had helpers who got him away and then left the money to distract everyone. Others think the police might have even planted it themselves to try and get new leads or close the case.
Ah, wow. It seems like every new clue just adds more layers to the mystery, making people speculate and argue even more. And even though the FBI officially stopped working on it in 2016, there are still tons of people out there trying to figure it out. What do you think is so appealing about this case, even after all these years?
I think it's the combination of things we've been talking about. The power of not knowing, the excitement of the chase, the idea of escaping a normal life and doing something amazing. It's a story that speaks to the rebellious part of us, the part that dreams of adventure and changing our own destiny.
And it's a story that's been told over and over again, each time with a new twist. It's cool to see how people have interpreted and reimagined it over the years and how it still inspires new creative stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that shows how strong the story itself is. Even if we never know the whole truth, the legend of D.B. Cooper stays with us, reminding us that there are still mysteries in the world that we can't easily explain.
It's a story that's become part of American folklore, and I think it'll keep fascinating and intriguing us for a long time to come. So we've talked about suspects' evidence theories, but what about the other people who tried to pull off a Cooper? Did anyone else copycat him?
Oh yeah, there were actually a bunch of copycats. Like I mentioned before, high-profile crimes, they often inspire others to try their luck. Some were more successful than others, but none captured the public imagination quite like Cooper did.
It's interesting to think about those copycat cases. I mean, what was it about Cooper's story that made it so unique and so enduring?
I think it was the combination of factors we've been discussing. The mystery, the audacity, the possibility that he got away with it, and maybe it was also the timing. You know, this happened during a time of social and political upheaval. There was a lot of distrust in authority, and I think Cooper's story tapped into that. It was a way to thumb your nose at the system, to take what you wanted and disappear.
That makes sense. It was like a vicarious thrill for people, a way to rebel against the establishment, even if just in their imaginations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's why his story continues to resonate with us even today. We live in a world where we're constantly being watched, tracked, monitored. And the idea of someone being able to slip through the cracks to escape the grid,
Yeah.
it's incredibly appealing.
It's the ultimate fantasy of freedom, isn't it? To just shed your identity and vanish into thin air without a trace.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what D.B. Cooper represents for so many people. He's a symbol of rebellion, of mystery, of the possibility of a different life.
So even though the FBI has officially closed the book on D.B. Cooper, his story continues to live on in our collective imagination. And I have a feeling it'll be that way for a long time to come.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's something about this case that just refuses to die. Maybe it's the unanswered questions, the possibility that he's still out there somewhere,
Hmm.
or maybe it's just the enduring power of a good mystery. Whatever the reason, D.B. Cooper continues to fascinate us. I don't think that'll ever change.
It really is amazing how this one case, this one guy has just stuck with people for so long. And like we've seen, there's just so much to keep that interest going.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so good.
Hmm.
We're not just going over the same old facts. We're digging into the details, the different sides of the story, and what D.B. Cooper means to us. It's like peeling back layers.
Hmm.
Every layer shows you something new.
So let's put all those layers together. After all this looking and thinking, what do you think is the big takeaway? What's the most interesting part of the D.B. Cooper case for you?
For me, it's how unclear it all is. The questions that are still there after all this time. Did he live? Where'd he go? Who was he really? Those questions and how bold the whole thing was, they make a story that's both exciting and frustrating. We want to know the mystery to figure it all out, but we also know the answers might never come.
Yeah, I totally get that. It's that what if that keeps us coming back. And it's why, even though the FBI officially closed the case, there are still so many people looking into it, coming up with ideas, searching for clues. It's almost like everyone's obsessed.
It is, and I think it shows how much we want things to make sense to understand. We want to believe that even the craziest mysteries can be solved, that there's a reason for everything. But sometimes the best stories are the ones that don't have easy answers.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to think about all this? We've looked at the evidence, we've talked about the theories, we've even gotten into how it's affected culture, but we still don't know for sure what happened to D.B. Cooper.
I think that's the cool part. The D.B. Cooper case makes us be okay with not knowing, to accept that some mysteries might just stay mysteries. And maybe that's where the real power of the story is, in the not knowing.
It's a story that makes us realize we don't know everything, that there are things in this world we just might not get.
And it reminds us that sometimes the journey is just as important as the ending. Looking for answers, thinking about different possibilities, trying to put the puzzle together, those are all important, even if we never find that one piece that makes it all clear.
So after all this talking and thinking, what do you think happened to D.B. Cooper?
Honestly, I don't think I have a for sure answer. And I think that's all right. The cool thing about this case is that it lets us all make up our own minds to look at what we know and decide what we believe. Maybe he's alive somewhere living a quiet life, or maybe he died that night. Or maybe there's something else we haven't even thought of yet.
That's D.B. Cooper for you. He keeps us guessing. He makes us question what we think we know, and he reminds us that the world is full of mysteries that are just waiting for us to explore.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great point to wrap up on. It's been awesome diving deep into this with you today.
Yeah, I agree. It's been a fascinating journey through one of the most enduring mysteries of our time. And even though we may never know for sure what happened to D.B. Cooper, I think we can all agree that his story continues to inspire wonder and intrigue. And that's something pretty special, don't you think?
I definitely do. And who knows, maybe one of our listeners out there will be the one to finally crack the case. But until then, the legend lives on. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never lose your sense of adventure.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mystery of D.B. Cooper. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration into the unknown.